Hello, Tansei, good afternoon, and welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Today's episode's topic is going to be a tough one, but it is one that needs to continue to be told and talked about. The month of December has been a horrific time for all families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people. While the remains of 3 Manitoba women have yet to be found and the search not yet confirmed. Today we're putting MMIWG 2S in focus, specifically the ongoing case involving Rebecca Contois, Morgan Harris, Marcedes Myran, and Buffalo Woman. Here's a quick rundown of what's happened so far. In May 2022, Jeremy Skibicki was charged with first-degree murder for the death of Rebecca Contois, whose partial remains were found in a landfill. Police said they had reason to believe there could be more victims. Fast forward to December 1st, 2022, Winnipeg police announced Skibicki was charged with 3 more counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Morgan Harris, Marcedes Myran, and an unidentified Indigenous woman, now referred to as Buffalo Woman. The bodies of these 3 women have not been found, but there was enough evidence to suggest they were murdered. Police told the families and media they believe the remains of Myran and Harris are at the Prairie Green Landfill north of Winnipeg, but they said a search isn't feasible. Too much time has passed and too much garbage has been disposed of. Indigenous leaders and advocates called for WPS to proceed with a search, and that Chief of Police Danny Smythe stepped down from his role. Now, the Prairie Green Landfill has agreed to halt operations while a decision is being made. And Police Board Chair Marcus Chambers says it should not be up to the board to decide what happens next.
That's really up to the Indigenous communities and the various levels of governments to determine what those next steps are.
Joining us now is Cambria Harris, the daughter of Morgan Harris. She's been at the forefront of calling for more action and resources in the search for her mother and Marcedes Myran. Cambria, first off, I want to thank you so much for just being here and joining us today. I can't imagine what the last few days, weeks, and months really have been like for you and your family. First off, how are you and your family doing?
Well, a lot of us haven't had the time to grieve, and we're just really angry right now at the way everything's being handled. And like Mark Chambers said, how it's up to the Indigenous communities and how it shouldn't be up for them to decide. I think that's really sad, and I think it shows where their core values are, and it's not with Indigenous peoples.
Well, so what did you think of the decision by the Winnipeg Police and the police board to say they're not going to be going ahead with a search?
I think it's really sad, because if you're not capable of being able to find these women, then why won't you just say that? Instead, they're beating around the bush and they're saying this and that, and they don't want to out front say it. And I think it's just wrong the way they're going about it and the way they're handling it. The press conferences, they haven't directly, spoken to me, even though I've said numerous times that I would, and I think it's just wrong.
Well, so Cambria, what would you like to see happen moving forward here with everything that's going on? What would you like to see being done?
Well, because the police have backed down now, and they've basically said that they will not find these women, I guess we have no other choice but to call on the federal government and all levels of government to do something, because these women deserve a proper burial, and the landfill is an resting place. And now we're protesting at Prairie because they're still dumping trash on top of remains that we've known to be there since 2012. And that anchors me too. So how many other women are they dumping trash on? Like, how many other landfills are their remains sitting in? And that haunts me.
Well, and just speaking to that, the Indigenous community has rallied in the wake of everything going on. Like you said, there's been blockades. Indigenous organizations are calling for support from the federal government, like you had just mentioned. What does that mean to you to have that kind of support?
I've watched my community come together in the most beautiful way. Like, we're so strong and stuff together when we're united, but it's for all the wrong reasons, and it's the most gut-wrenching situation, and we've watched it happen hundreds of times, and it breaks my heart. And Sunday, when I went to the vigil, everyone held up a sign saying another missing and murdered Indigenous woman's name, and that line went for 25-30 minutes, and it didn't end. And that was my wake-up call that this is an ongoing crisis for all missing murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people.
And what would you say, Cambria, to someone who also has a missing loved one or had a loved one murdered? What would you say to them?
I would just say I'm so sorry that over and over again society has swept this under the rug and accepted it and forgotten about us like as if we're nothing. And it shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't have gotten to this point, just to make sure that your voices are heard. And I'm sad, but I'm also honored to be able to speak on behalf of all these women and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Well, how have you dealt with that aspect of it? I don't imagine you came into this thinking that you'd be, I don't want to say a spokesperson, I don't know if that's the right word, but a lot of people are sticking to what you're saying, and they want to hear what you're saying. How has that sort of affected you, and I guess, how do you make, or what do you make of that, of being a spokesperson, so to speak?
It just goes to show how many other Indigenous peoples go through similar situations, and the many different systemic ways we've been oppressed over the years. And I've had many people reach out to me saying, like, my cousin went missing in 2000, whatever, never been found, the police refused to search the landfill then, etc. I've gotten other reports of, stories being done in other landfills and them being actually able to recover the remains, and the remains have been there longer and far deeper, etc.
And Cambria, can you walk us through maybe what you're looking at in terms of next steps, and maybe what's sort of coming up here in terms of next steps, really?
Well, last night I saw a statement released from SCO, but it was like Chief Jerry Daniels and Chief Carl Wilson and Sarah Delarond and Grand Chief Roseanne Archibald all signing on calling upon the federal government and the United Nations to provide the resources and funds for any and all searches, because now this is a human rights crisis and it shouldn't have to be.
Well, yeah, and it really is, and it's not just here in Winnipeg. I mean, this is a national and really international issue too, if you look at the United States. So you touched on the United Nations aspect of it. Why is it so important to get them involved as well in all this?
Because the police are, I hate to say it, but, and I did say it, we saw it happen with residential schools and the unmarked graves, and how we're still digging up unmarked graves, and with the way they're handling it, potentially what they're doing is creating more unmarked graves of Indigenous peoples at a landfill. And that's not a resting place. Our women are sacred, and we need to treat them like so. They deserve so much more. Instead of just being treated like remains, they were human, they were someone. They lived a life full of stories and love. And I've seen the stories of, Marcedes Myran, and, how the system failed her, and the system failed my mother in the exact same way, and more.
Well, and you're a mother yourself, right, Cambria? I'm just wondering how maybe that sort of affected you as a mother, to sort of see what's going on, and how maybe you'd like to see change so that stuff like this doesn't happen to other, kids or mothers or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm doing it for all of the ones that did go missing, and, to prevent our women from going missing again. And I'm doing it for my mother, and I'm doing it for my daughter and all the other younger generations, because I'm dreading the day that I have to tell my daughter that she has to be careful because of her race. And, I think that's very sad, and I shouldn't have to say that to my kid. And I think that just goes to show how normalized this is within society.
Well, and how do we make it so that something like this isn't normal? How do we go about to make sure that this isn't something where somebody sees a headline and it's another, oh, well, it's just, here we go again. Like, how do we make sure that something like this stops happening? I know it's something that's been going on for such a long time, and it's an issue that we always need to bring up because it is such an important issue. How do we stop that from happening?
I would ask the world to put their egos aside and sit down with their families and have a serious conversation on what's going on. And as uncomfortable as it is, those uncomfortable conversations is what creates change and helps you change that sort of mindset. And I do believe that if you have that kind of mindset, you are able to change it. You just got to be willing to accept it. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. And none of it's going to change overnight. There's a million different things that we need to do to address this ongoing issue, because it's not just, people going missing. It's other things leading up to that causes it.
And does it give you a bit of hope? I had mentioned this before, but does it give you a little bit of hope to see so many people coming together, the community and all these organizations and politicians and advocates? Does it give you a little sense of hope that this cycle can be broken?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely does give me hope that this cycle of violence can be broken. And I think it's beautiful the way people are come together, and we shouldn't have to raise our voices. We shouldn't have to shout and, beg for non-Indigenous peoples just to hear us. Like, we have voices, and we've had voices for a very, very long time, and now the world's just starting to listen, and I'm grateful for that, and I think that's a start.
And you've traveled pretty extensively all over. I mean, you're here in Winnipeg, you were in Ottawa, you've been to different vigils and blockades and that sort of thing. Why is it important for you to be going to all of these places and speaking up and sharing your voice?
It's about raising awareness and sending a message that, Indigenous peoples have, we have rights too, and we have the rights to dignity, we have the rights to respect, we have the rights to bring our loved ones home and proper burials. And it's important to go to other places and raise awareness, because then those people in those other places can go, wow, you know what, like, I see a lot of the same issues here. And Winnipeg just happens to be the epicenter of it because over 50% of our population is Indigenous. So Winnipeg is the perfect place to start making that change.
And what would you say, I know, there's been discussions with police and they've already said they can't search, but what would you say to maybe other people in power, politicians, and maybe other police forces around the country about what to do in this sort of situation so that something like this doesn't happen again?
It's time to address and acknowledge that this is an ongoing crisis. And Mark Miller said it perfectly when I spoke in the House of Commons. He said, it feels uncomfortable for me to stand in front of them and have my back turned because the government has failed Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years. And that's true. And it's all levels of government. So it's not a personal attack on anyone. It was the systems before, whoever was sitting in that chair and that person who did it. So that's what the world needs to realize. But it starts with the people in those powerful positions to be able to make that change. And when they have the power and the voices, then they also have the opportunity to listen to the people as well.
Well, and listening to the people is such a great point there. And, I don't want to cut our conversation too short here, but we're getting almost to that point. But giving power to the people is such an important thing to do. And I mean, you're doing it, and other advocates and that sort of thing are doing it. So I just want to say a thank you to sharing your voice. But before we let you go, are you able to share maybe some immediate next steps of what's happening next in terms of looking for a search, maybe?
Well, actually this morning I had a forensic expert reach out to me, and he was from the U.S., and he said that he might be able to help in some way. So I passed his information along to my chief, Carl Wilson. So, that's a start, and it goes to show that the police might not be willing to help us, but we got an entire nation behind us as well. So I need your help.
And you had just mentioned, I mean, this is, like I said, it's an international issue, and it seems like the whole world is sort of looking at this right now. How significant is that there's people from all over the place that are like, hey, like, we need to do something in here, maybe I can help, or like, how important is that?
That's amazing. I just wish federal governments would step up, and, we have the people willing to do it, so why can't you provide the funds to be able to help us retrieve these remains? I've said myself I'll get in there, and I know many other people will as well, no matter how dangerous it is.
Well, Cambria, I don't want to take up any more of your time, so I want to say thank you, MMIWG, to you for joining us and speaking with us and sharing your story. We'll have to leave our conversation there for now, but this is certainly a conversation that will not be going away and something that we will continually bring up. So again, thank you, MMIWG, to you for sharing some of your story and joining us here on APTN InFocus. All right, we have to step aside for a short break. We'll be right back with more In Focus.
Our conversation now. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page, follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Joining us now is Hilda Anderson-Piers. She is an MMIWG2S advocate and the chair of the National Family and Survivors Circle. So Hilda, I want to say a big thank you, miigwech, to you for coming in and joining us today on such an important topic.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I guess first off, just what are your thoughts on what's been happening, the last few days, weeks, but what's been happening for such a long time here in this country and in the United States as well?
First of all, I just wanted to, express my sincere condolence to all the families across this country who have been impacted by the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. But it's utterly heartbreaking, what's happening right now. It's like, how do you deal with this? How are the families dealing with the trauma from the, not knowing that their loved one has been disposed of in a landfill, and that basically police have cited it as impossible to recover their loved one's remains. It's an important part of their healing and their mental health to be able to have a ceremony and have a proper burial for their loved one.
Yeah, it really is. And you're an advocate, so you work directly with communities and with families affected. What is some of the community and directly into the community? What are some of the people there saying about what's going on?
Well, there's a lot of talks about, that this is a human rights issue. It continues. When you look at, the inability of all levels of government to meet the basic human rights needs of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, it's, really concerning that there's such a lack of action and effort to create those pathways for the safety and security of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. But there's also a lot of fear in community. That we're dying at alarming rates across the country. We're experiencing violence at alarming rates. And, what amplifies that fear is the lack of police response as well. When we experience violence, there's a saying that goes with Indigenous women, girls, and to us people in this country that we're over-policed and underprotected.
Well, that's a really great saying, actually, now that you think about it. So there does seem to be a disconnect between in this case specifically, between the Winnipeg police and the Indigenous community. Where do you think that disconnect lies?
I think, where that comes from is the structural and systemic racism that is deeply embedded within policing institutions and agencies. The lack of effort to really meet and address the needs of the Indigenous population when it comes to their safety and security is clearly demonstrated by the outcomes we're seeing right now with the Winnipeg police.
So given what you just said and thinking of a more broader scope of things, what can be done? I know we've asked this so many different times throughout however many years in cases of this. What can be done?
Well, with the national inquiry, when it was, taking place and traveling coast to coast across the country, policing was problematic in every place where they had hearings and a lot of the testimony from family members and survivors and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. And there are 11 specific calls related under the justice related to policing, that police have a responsibility to implement and act upon, because the 231 calls for justice are legal imperatives, and they have to ensure that they have to look at their policies, their procedures, and the way that and their conduct as well, and there has to be accountability measures in place to deal with their conduct, but also accountability measures in place to see how they're implementing the 231 calls to justice that they're responsible for.
Well, just on that note, with the 231 calls to justice, I mean, there's been 11 Indigenous women in Winnipeg murdered this year, and I believe your family member is one, so my condolences to you.
Yeah, thank you.
So where I'm going with this is there's been 11 in Winnipeg. There's been, I think Stats Canada said last year there was 45 Indigenous women who died of police-reported homicide. Did you ever think that 3 years out from the end of the national inquiry that we'd be here with the numbers getting worse?
No, actually, when the national inquiry was launched and it was taking place across the country and the final report was released, I had a lot of hope for, a lot of change and for action, to build those pathways for safety and security for us as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in this country. But there's such a lack of political will. Governments have a responsibility to act, and there seems to be some type of barrier in place from preventing them on acting on ending this genocide, and each day of inaction, you know, results in the continuance of murder, the continuance of this genocide.
Well, and they're called calls for justice, right? It's not, and it seems like I can't remember where I saw this, but I think I was speaking with Sandra Delarond about this, and I said they are calls for justice, not calls for hope. And a lot of people are saying right now it just seems like they're calls for hope. So you had touched on it a bit. How do we get governments involved? How do we get police to work on what's happening? How do we get people in general to make sure that these calls for justice are being implemented?
I think, you know, they need to learn about the 231 calls for justice and where they fit in, and develop strategies and mechanisms and policies and procedures, and as well legislation on how to fully action the 231 calls for justice. But also, if they're not acting on the implementation of the 231 calls for justice, I think, you know, we're at a place in Canada right now where, you know, we have to shine a international human rights group's lens on the lack of action in relation to the safety and security of Indigenous women, girls, and to us people in this country.
Well, with what you just said, there's a call for a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights for Indigenous peoples to come in and sort of oversee what's going on here. Mm-hmm. Why is that so important that we have an outside look, especially from an international point of view, on what's going on?
Well, it's critical because, you know, someone has to hold the Canadian government and other levels of government, like provincial, federal, territorial, and Indigenous governments accountable for acting in relation to the 231 calls for justice, because they're all legally obligated to act and implement the 231 calls for justice. And if they are not doing it, then we have to look at outside support, you know, to put that pressure on Canada to act. And
when you see all of the Indigenous community come together, and I mean, there's been blockades at the landfill, I was speaking with Cambria about that, there's been so many different rallies and vigils and everybody coming together, does that maybe give you hope that something can change eventually, that people are caring about this, and it might not be sort of the right people right now, but with enough that it can change?
I think, actually, you know what, when I see community gather, like, it's actually heartbreaking, and it's sad that we have to continuously gather in numbers, you know, to support families who have been impacted by the genocide that is occurring across this country. And each time we gather, it diminishes our hope because the numbers are increasing at alarming rates. So, you know, I don't see a lot of hope in that, like when we're continuously gathering because we're dying at alarming rates. Right. You know, I'd rather see us gathering in community celebrations, you know, celebrating that our human rights are being met and that we're living good lives, we're living secure lives, and as Indigenous girls, they have the ability to dream and fulfill those dreams. That's what I see hope.
So is that what you see hope in then, is
yes.
Maybe the future of what could happen, and well, right now it's not, you know, the best of times?
No, I think, you know, like as an advocate, it's deeply concerning, you know, the violence that we're experiencing, and systems that are supposed to protect us and respond to the violence are basically saying to Indigenous communities, it's your job, go figure it out on your own. That's very problematic. You know, so I don't see it as hopeful. Like, I see it as deeply concerning.
So in the immediate future, and specifically with the landfill searches, what do you think should be done as some next steps that could, I mean, there was a statement that went out yesterday of the UN Special Rapporteur and funds from the federal government. So what do you think should happen that these women are brought home and they do have a resting place?
I think, you know, there has to be, you know, obviously a feasibility, I'll say a feasibility action plan, because there's, you know, you can't have any inaction when it comes to our Indigenous women, girls, and to us people, you know, being cruelly taken and dumped in landfills. You know, we need action. We need to ensure that those families who are impacted by, you know, this horrific tragedy, that they're supported and that they have the closure and they are able to take their loved one home to their final resting place, surrounded in love and light and ceremony as well. You know, but more importantly, we need resources in our communities, you know, across this country and across Manitoba too. When we look at, you know, the safety and security, we need to start at a very young age, you know, where young Indigenous girls are, and to us people, And even boys are learning about like who they are. They're learning their language, their culture, their identity within their schools and their community. And there's programs and services, you know, that really strengthen that family approach and that community approach, but also there has to be safety plans and education when our women and girls and 2S people are leaving our communities. We need to ensure that adequate resources are provided within communities, and even, you know, supports to women and girls and 2S people who are experiencing violence within our communities too. There has to be different, like whether it's shelters, you know, different types of programming, but often we see governments just supporting, you know, programming, but they're not supporting the infrastructure, like the O&M, operation and maintenance, and also service delivery. You can't just piecemeal it. If you want success in communities, you have to ensure, you know, that the infrastructure is there, the O&M is there, and the programs are there, and that they're sustainable too. You know, our lives are not projects, and you often see governments funding very 1 to 2 year projects, and then you're continuously having to submit proposals, and I think that's unethical. You know, when it comes to our safety and security, they have to do better and provide long-term sustainable funding to our communities.
Well, Hilda, that's certainly well said. We're going to have to leave our conversation there, but that's not the end of the conversation, right? We'll always continue to work on this and bring this issue to the forefront. So I want to say a big thank you, Miigwech, to you for joining us and sharing some of what you have to say. So thank you, Miigwech.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, it's time for one final break, but still ahead, we'll speak with more MMIWG advocates. Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Joining me now in studio is Long Plain First Nation Chief Kyra Wilson. Chief Wilson, thank you, Miigwech, for taking some time to speak with us and to talk about this very, very important subject. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess first off, just what are your thoughts on everything that's happened in the last, you know, few weeks and months here?
It's a lot. Actually, it's a lot for not only myself, but especially the families, you know, that have been directly impacted. It's a lot for the community, you know, Long Plain First Nation, but also for, you know, all of our First Nations communities, not only in Manitoba, but across the country. I believe that it is triggering for a lot of people. So it has been a difficult week and a half to 2 weeks. So.
Yeah, it really has, and for everybody. Now, I understand you've met with police numerous times now in the police board, right? And are you able to share sort of some of what's come from those conversations? I think you met this morning, right? Are you able to share some of what happened there?
Yeah, so we did meet with the chief of police today. This was the first meeting that we had, or that I had actually as chief for Long Plain, and it's you know, a step in the right direction, and I'm hoping that you know, the words that were shared today, you know, do have meaning behind it, and there will be action that will happen following the meeting that we had this morning. So,
well, you and others like yourself have called for Chief Smythe to resign. So, did the words this morning maybe draw those back a bit, or how did that sort of affect that?
Well, like I said, I'm just waiting to see what the action is going to be. You know, the call for resignation was due to the inaction of, you know, calls for searches of the landfill, and I'm just here to support the families and just be that supportive role, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that families are feeling supported right now.
Well, and you're the chief of Long Plain First Nation. That's where 2 of the women are from that were unfortunately murdered. How's the community of Long Plain doing with all of this?
Well, like I had mentioned, you know, some people are triggered. Unfortunately, this is not the first incident of someone that is a part of our community, that is our family, that is missing. And so there's a lot of sadness and hurt and anger. And it's unfortunate that we're having yet to talk about this again.
Well, and in your opinion, what do you think needs to happen in these next steps and as we work towards the future to ending this violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people?
Well, everyone needs to come together, all levels of government, police services, you know, leadership. We all need to come together to formulate some sort of a plan on how we're going to protect our Indigenous women, our girls, Two-Spirit. It's so important that everyone is on the same page when we talk about, the vulnerability and the risks that our women are having to face every single day when they leave our First Nations communities.
Mm-hmm. And there was a statement sent out by, again, a number of Indigenous organizations, yourself, talking about, here's a few things of what needs to happen. And I believe it was the first on the list was having a UN special rapporteur to oversee sort of what's going on here. Why was that so important?
Well, it just speaks to the human rights issue. Why is it that Indigenous people are continually left behind when we talk about supports and services and just basic human rights? We have, an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, and no one is listening. So what exactly do we need to do to make sure that our voices are heard? So I do believe that we need to have as many people that are going to support our families, our communities, coming together right now to ensure that this work continues to move forward.
And can you talk about some of the other things that were on that statement? I believe there was also funding from the federal government to fund the search. Can you just sort of touch on what else that statement really was asking for?
So yes, there was the request for supports for searching of the landfill. We know that 2 of our women, if not more, are in these 2 landfills. I know the focus right now has been the Prairie Green landfill, but we are also talking about the Brady landfill as well. And so the request is to receive supports for these searches at all levels of government, not just the federal government. And the other request is making sure that we have those supports in place for families that are impacted by the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we're 3 years past the national inquiry, and I had mentioned, previously with Hilda, did you think that 3 years past, some of the numbers and of here in Winnipeg and just across the country, that some of these numbers of Indigenous women being unfortunately murdered or they're getting worse? Did you think that 3 years after the inquiry that they'd be getting worse?
Well, I honestly thought that, with the inquiry that there would be action shortly thereafter. There was a lot of work and spirit that was put into that. We had a lot of families come forward to share their thoughts and their perspectives and their needs. And, it was very important work that was done. And it was our hope that there would have been action following that, but we haven't seen anything, unfortunately. And to be quite honest, I don't really know why that is. There's so many people that came forward with that inquiry.
Well, is that maybe part of the issue too? Is it like you had said, nobody's really sure why there hasn't been a lot of action, right? Is that part of the issue of asking government for this and asking government to maybe do something here, but nothing's really being said? Is that part of the issue that's going on here?
Well, when you're in a leadership role, there's so many issues that you're having to deal with, and it's all about a balance and priorities, and there is a number of issues that all levels of government are needing to address right now, and it is about that balance. So we have many families that are impacted by the child welfare system or the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit issue, the issue of genocide. So it is really important that when you are in a leadership position at any level of government, that you are making sure that you are prioritizing all of these different needs and you're addressing every single need that is being asked or requested.
Well, and when it comes to specifically the search, what do you think are the immediate next steps? I know the statement went out asking for some of. So, what do you think is some of the immediate next steps to make sure that these women are brought home?
Well, the first step right now is looking at a feasibility study. What is a plan and a budget to search these landfills? That is the first step that we are moving towards. Once we have that plan and that budget, then we will be able to have a clear idea of what we are needing to do to move forward.
And what do you say to another family member or a community that's going through something like this? I mean, you're chief of Long Plain, and I understand that the family and yourself, to an extent, would be grieving a little bit, right? So what do you say to somebody else who might be going through the same thing?
Well, that's a very difficult question, just given the fact that every community is different, but we're all dealing with the same issues. And at the end of the day, all we really have is each other, whether that's communities or families. And for me, I see a lot of leaders coming forward and advocating for the supports of our families, and just know that, you know, they're not alone, that we're all here for them, and that their voices are being heard, and whatever it is that they are needing us to do, we will do it.
And it seems like Winnipeg and this issue has sort of hit the peak of it's at an international level. It seems like a lot of people from around the world are looking at this, unfortunately, like it looked at the unmarked graves. How significant is that, do you think, that the international world is also looking in and seeing what's going to happen next?
Well, you know, internationally, we have many Indigenous groups, Indigenous people that are dealing with the same issues. Unfortunately, that's the reality of being an Indigenous person globally. You know, a lot of our needs are fallen to the wayside, and so with, you know, all of the Indigenous people or First Nations people, whatever that is, or whoever that is, you know, we are all dealing with the same thing, and so we're looking to each other for that support and for those answers. And even with the non-Indigenous community, some of these things are very shocking. And I've had many people reach out to me and share that, you know, they can't believe that this is happening right now, and it is a human rights issue. And it's not just an Indigenous issue right now, what we're dealing with.
Well, and you just mentioned that there's non-Indigenous people who are like, wow, like I didn't know this was going on. Again, much like unmarked graves and all the other issues. How significant is it that they're also becoming aware of what's going on? And it seems like they want to know a little bit of what's going on now as opposed to before.
Well, I think as we move throughout time, we have more and more Indigenous people that are becoming more vocal about the needs of our communities, and that is, you know, an educational piece that, you know, we are providing, you know, as we move forward with addressing all these different issues. And I'm just really grateful for all the leadership that has talked about all these different issues for years. And now we're just continuing on with that fight, and I think that we are just continuing on with that work that's already been done.
Well, Chief Wilson, that's really well said. I think that's a good way to maybe pause our conversation for now. Again, this is a conversation that needs to continue to be told and shared and the like. So I want to say thank you, MMIWG, to you, especially for coming in and sharing some of your thoughts and your insights. And again, this conversation won't be going away anytime soon. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to speak with us.
Thank you.
All right, and our next guest now is Sandra Delarond, and she is also an MMIWG 2S advocate here in Winnipeg. So I spoke with her yesterday, and this is a bit of our conversation that we had. Sandra, we really, really appreciate you taking some time to come in and speak with us about this very important issue today. First off, just what do you make of everything that's happened over the last, you know, few days, few weeks, and even a few months here with what's going on in the city of Winnipeg?
Well, I think that what is happening right now is really an issue that has been going on for many years. I mean, the National Inquiry had said the matters around Indigenous women and girls is nothing less than genocide. So we see it in its active practice, day in and day out.
Well, and touching on the Winnipeg police, they had said it's up to the Indigenous community basically to do the search of the landfill themselves and to come up with the resources and all of that. I mean, what do you make of that? I understand there's a statement that went out calling for resources, right?
Yes, well, our statement really solidified because of the comments of the chair of the Winnipeg Police Board, who basically said to the Indigenous people, again, you're on your own. You know, the resources that we have are not for you. So we collectively, the MMIWG Implementation Committee, the representative political organizations of chiefs in Manitoba, got together and wrote a letter to the federal minister seeking, first of all, the oversight of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous issues. Also, resources to conduct a feasibility and a search plan, and resources for the impacted families, and the ability to move on considering the RCMP take over the not the investigation, but the recovery. And we also believe that there may be others that have been missing that may be in those sites as well.
Right. So why did everybody see the need? Was it the announcement, or was this something that was maybe planned even before what was said by the Winnipeg Police Board?
It has been. We have been working on this particular matter since the police had announced that it wasn't feasible, and we asked the question, why not? And so we know that the chiefs were all in Ottawa last week doing their work, and the implementation committee was here in Winnipeg doing their work, and together, we put all our resources and our thoughts together about how this can move forward with the input of the Indigenous community.
Now, I know a lot of your work involves working with the Indigenous community specifically and within communities. What are you hearing from them? What are they saying about what's going on, and maybe what they would like to see happen?
Well, our comments are based upon input from families and community members. We've had opportunities to meet with the community twice last week and seek direction on how they wanted to proceed with this. So I think we are doing what we can, based on real-time input from community members.
And this is something that you had mentioned at the start of the show, that this has been ongoing for years and years and years, and doesn't seem like it's getting any better. What would you like to see in the next coming days, weeks, and months leading up to maybe eventually a point where we can stop all of this violence?
Well, in this time and space right now, we want to ensure that all level of governments take the safety of Indigenous women and girls, take that seriously and find ways that they can, change their policies and practices to begin to turn the tide of this ongoing genocide. On an ongoing basis, on one hand, we're dealing with very specific life and death issues, safety issues, and we've talked about safe injection sites. We talked about basic livable income, shelter for those that don't have shelter, and those were all, part of the 231 calls to justice. 24/7 low barrier safe shelter. So we need to put some dollars, governments need to put some dollars behind that, those 231 calls to justice, and have them enacted now. We're losing this battle.
Well, I think, I can't remember exactly who it was, it might have been yourself, but somebody had said it's 231 calls for justice, not 231 calls for hope. right? Is that, and I remember seeing that and I said, well, that's really what it is all about, right? And how you just mentioned, like, we need concrete, dollars, we need this in order to be able to have all of that, right? Like, is that what you're saying basically with it's the calls for justice, not calls for hope right now, which it seems like a lot of it might be right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, for years it has been about justice, and we think that we're in a situation now when we had the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, we had the Royal Commission, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we had the National Inquiry, and each time our people, led with their tears and commitments by government to create change. But what we found is that nothing has changed. So people can see that they can murder Indigenous women without impunity. So we need to see that because we're the highest population that is murdered, that it is in fact a hate crime, and that people need to be charged and tried on that basis. Nothing less is going to change the situation.
Well, and why is that specifically so important to this, to all of this that's happening as well?
Well, because laws haven't changed. People that go before the courts for the murder of Indigenous women are generally charged with maybe 2 manslaughter. But I can, give the Winnipeg Police credit and the Crowns for actually, in this matter, having 4 separate charges of first-degree murder. That is unheard of when it comes to an Indigenous woman in this country. So I think they got that right. It is the dignity of the remains of the women. It's about closure. It's being able to say goodbye for the families that we need to be able. That is just as important as the charges.
And I believe it's 11 Indigenous women have been murdered here in Winnipeg this year, and Statistics Canada said in their latest 2021 report there were 45 Indigenous women victims of police-reported homicide. And we're here now, and did you ever think that 3 years out from the end of the National Inquiry that these numbers would be getting worse even than when it had started?
Well, no. I had expected there to be some action, but it will keep getting worse until there is action. Well,
and for those that are out there and at home and they're watching this, I mean, for a lot of people it can be disheartening to keep seeing these numbers getting worse, especially when it pertains to Indigenous women and violence against Indigenous women. I mean, we've talked about maybe what can be done, but as an overall arching theme, I mean, what do you say to those at home that are looking for something to base off of in terms of it getting better or change coming?
Well, what I would say to Indigenous women and girls is it's not our fault. It's not our fault that governments have failed to act. However, we are strong and stronger together, and we can keep pushing together to create safer spaces for ourselves, for our children and our grandchildren. There's no other option. And it's not about hope, it's not about resilience, it's about human dignity, and we deserve it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great way to say that, Sandra. I think that's a wonderful way to maybe leave our conversation for now. Obviously, this is something that's not going to be going away anytime soon, and it needs the action, and it needs, to be constantly covered. So I want to say a big thank you, Miigwech, to you for taking some time out of your day and sharing what you think needs to be done and what needs to happen for this to eventually, hopefully, end. So thank you, Miigwech.
Miigwech.
And the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs announced earlier today that Grand Chief Kathy Merrick has been named the spokesperson for the landfill searches moving forward. All right, that's all we have for you today on APTN in Focus. But again, the conversation around violence towards Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people must carry on. Today's episode will be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts, or you can find us on your favorite player. And if you missed any of our past episodes, or you want to watch this one again and catch up, you can find them and more on aptnnews.ca/infocus. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you so much for joining us, Miigwech, and have a great afternoon.